All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome and thanks for joining us today. My name is Chris Abinasif, and I am the director of the Lebanon program at the Middle East Institute. I'm really pleased to introduce you to today's event, Stopping the Slide, the Deterioration of Human Rights in Lebanon. Since the onset of the Lebanese protest movement nearly 18 months ago, the increase of human rights violation has been both gradual and very evident. In today's webinar, we have an excellent panel of experts who are going to discuss how the situation has been evolving on the ground in Lebanon and what the international community can do to help avert this dangerous slide into potentially irreversible deterioration of freedoms, civil rights and human rights in Lebanon. So before we begin, I'd really like to welcome Aya Majzoub. Aya is the Lebanon and the Bahrain researcher at the Human Rights Watch. She's based in Beirut. Next, we have Philippe Nassif. Philip is the advocacy director for the Middle East and North Africa at Amnesty International. Thank you both for joining. And then finally, I'm really pleased to introduce Renda Slim, who's the senior fellow and the director of conflict resolution and Track 2 dialogues here at the Middle East Institute. So to submit your questions, please feel free to use Zoom's Q&A feature that you can see at the bottom of your screens. And then for those of you calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream on YouTube, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. Our team will be monitoring that inbox, and then we'll be channeling these questions to us here in the box as well. If you have any technical issues along the way, please also feel free to email events@mei.edu. Feel free to ask any question at any time. Both the panelists and I will be looking at these questions in the chat, and we'll factor in as many as possible into our conversation. Before we begin, also, I'd like to invite you to another panel that the Lebanon program is hosting tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern as part of MEI's Climate Week. We'll be joined by our own Jessica Abed, who's the MEI non-resident fellow, Sylvia Krasembini, who's the policy officer for the Middle East, North Africa, and the Gulf at the European Commission's Directorate General for Climate Action, and then finally by Vahakin Kabakian, who's the climate change advisor and portfolio manager at UNDP in Beirut. We'll be discussing Lebanon's ambitious climate change policy and the many ways it can contribute to economic revival post-collapse. Our team will be sharing that link shortly in the chat as well, so feel free to join us at 11 a.m. EDT tomorrow. If you would like to hear more. Okay, with that said, let us maybe kick this off with you, Aya. So in many ways, you know, you're this panel's eyes and ears on the ground in Lebanon, and it would be really useful if you can just walk us through the main in your mind, right? The main and then the most dangerous developments that you've seen unfolding over the past few months when it comes to freedoms and the overall state of human rights in Lebanon. So over to you, Aya. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Chris, and thanks everyone for being here for what I hope to be a very exciting conversation, though a bit bleak. So in HRW's assessment of the rights situation in Lebanon in 2020, we found that the Lebanese authorities' corruption and failure to address the massive crises that the country was facing have resulted in the most drastic deterioration of rights in decades. And that's not a description that we use very lightly. Lebanon is going through multiple overlapping crises, including an economic collapse, rising political instability, the explosion in the port, and the global pandemic. But perhaps the crisis with the most severe impacts on rights, I think, is the economic crisis. So as many people will know, since September 2019, the national currency has lost more than 85% of its value. The poverty rate has doubled in the last year alone, with more than half of the population living below the poverty line, and the extreme poverty rate has tripled. So what this means on the ground is that thousands of businesses have been forced to close because they can't afford to pay for imports anymore or can't afford to pay their staff. Tens of thousands have been laid off. Experts predict that the unemployment rate has surpassed 35%. And those who are still employed have either had their salaries slashed or seen the value of their salary drastically decline. The minimum wage in Lebanon used to be around $450. It's now worth just over $50. That people can't even access their savings to help them get through this tough time, as money is stuck in banks that are insolvent and they're gradually losing value. Meanwhile, inflation is off the charts. The price of food has quadrupled in the past year. The price of clothing and footwear has risen 6 times. People are literally bartering goods. Some families are so desperate that Facebook pages have popped up offering personal belongings like shoes and glassware in exchange for diapers and baby formula. And the dire economic situation is pushing people into some pretty desperate situations. There's been a very worrying spike in crime rates. Murders and car robberies have almost doubled in the last year. And unfortunately, there's no indication that the situation is getting better, as the government is very quickly running out of foreign currency reserves that it uses to subsidize the import of vital goods like medicine and fuel. So medicine and medical supplies are now running out quickly. We have shortages of painkillers, baby formula, anti-anxiety medication, some forms of antibiotics. Gas stations are rationing fuel. Most gas stations are now open for only a few days a week and only a few hours a day. Electricity rationing has increased. We've always had blackouts. They used to be up to 3 hours per day in Beirut. Now they last up to 20 hours a day. But despite how dire the situation is, there hasn't been a single coordinated evidence-based policy that I can point to that the Lebanese authorities have taken to limit the scale of the crisis. This has led to the World Bank issuing a statement that I think was quite unprecedented. They said that Lebanon was in a deliberate depression, as in the deliberate lack of policy action by the Lebanese authorities has subjected the economy to an arduous and prolonged depression that the World Bank said is likely to cause Lebanon's economic crisis to be deeper and longer than most economic crises. So the authorities aren't addressing the massive economic crisis, and they can't even get their act together to form a government. Instead, we're seeing the authorities escalate their repression. So we've documented increases in the prosecutions and interrogations of journalists, activists, and rights defenders who are critical of the authorities. We've documented trials of protesters in military courts, which are inherently unfair, and unwarranted terrorism charges against some protesters. We've documented enforced disappearances and torture. We've also documented excessive and sometimes lethal force used by security agencies against protesters, often with total impunity. So yeah, unfortunately, the situation is quite bleak in terms of rights, both the economic, social rights and the civil and political rights. And the outlook is unfortunately not positive unless the international community really changes its approach to Lebanon.
Thanks, Aya. And Philippe, let me also turn to you, along these same lines. I know that a lot of the work that Amnesty's been doing has been focusing on, some of these issues that Aya has raised as well. So very curious to hear your thoughts about what are the critical issues that you're looking at and how these things could potentially evolve as well in the months ahead, because the situation doesn't seem to be getting any better, right? It looks like we're on a downward trajectory. Things are getting uglier, nastier, potentially on the streets or even socioeconomically. So curious about your thoughts on these as well.
Sure. Yes. Thank you. And I appreciate that Aya kind of laying out that the current state of affairs in the country, however bleak it sounds. I think it's a reality that is on the ground, and is a reality that we are confronting at Amnesty, just like our friends at Human Rights Watch and many of the other civil society organizations in Lebanon, human rights organizations, and of course policymakers here in the United States and then in the European capitals. So I'm based here in DC. I handle all of our work with the U.S. government, and I can tell you two things. One, we are focused on the same things on the ground that Human Rights Watch is focused, that Aya has just laid out. The nepotism, the designed system of corruption that has caused the steady decline in quality of life, the steady decline in security in the country, the steady decline in the overall economy. It's been a spectacular collapse to watch. Every single day, it gets worse. And every single day, new ideas are put forward to help solve the crisis. And then every single day, the same people in power refuse to consider those new ideas or old ideas to help address the situation unfolding in the country. So our concerns are just like what Aya just laid out in terms of Human Rights Watch's research. We have the security services that have used excessive force on numerous occasions when protesters were out in the streets in mass in Lebanon over the past year and a half or so before COVID and then during COVID. We recently released a report on the state of refugees in Lebanon. Do not forget that there are well over 1 million Syrian refugees that fled the horrible war just on the other side of the border in Syria into Lebanon, seeking safe haven. And now they too have seen their economic prospects, which were already very bleak before this situation unfolded in Lebanon, collapse before their eyes as well. And so you have that other dynamic that is worsening at the same time as the overall general population, Lebanese population, suffers economically as well. And so we remain very concerned about the well-being of those vulnerable populations, let alone the fact that they're more vulnerable to COVID and aren't getting the vaccines that they need and the security that they need as they face reprisals from people in the country because of the stress that they're all under due to the economic collapse. So we're concerned about all of those issues as well. As far as what the U.S. government has been, sort of conveying to us and what we've been having in discussions with the U.S. government is how to continue to support Lebanese civil society, which has sort of risen up to take the place of this failed governance model in the country that has done absolutely nothing since the Beirut port blast decimated parts of the capital, Beirut, and since the economic collapse, which started before the blast and steadily got worse after the blast, to the point where we are today, where we have more than 80% of the currency has lost its value. So I'll offer a sort of positive note in the sense that I have been amazed at the younger generation of Lebanese and the generation of Lebanese who no longer want to be aligned with the political class that is currently running the country, coming forward with ideas that sort of sideline the political class to the extent that they want to get things done. And that's been manifesting itself in some of the rebuilding in Beirut. That's manifesting itself in some of the political ideas that are being put forward, more open, secure elections, more people running for parliament seats, regardless of whatever system they have in place in Lebanon, more people putting forward ideas on Lebanon being a neutral country. I mean, all of these sorts of ideas have been put forward over the last several weeks and months. And, people are no longer afraid to challenge the governing status quo that has existed for so long. I think the question now we're all wrestling with, or the questions, is how to address, armed groups in the country like Hezbollah, how to address the economic collapse and stop it from continuing to get worse, because unfortunately it can get worse, and it likely will unless something is done, and how to sort of unlock some of these aid dollars that the international community has pledged to the country, sending it straight to the Lebanese people, getting that critical aid for infrastructure, for food, water, medicine, for those that are in need, which is the majority of the population now, to sort of help prevent the country not just collapsing economically, which is already done, but collapsing socially, where we're going to see strife and more violence in the streets. We don't want that to happen. And that's something that my conversation with the US government has been sort of very clear, in the sense that they don't want to see another country, in a sense, fall apart in the region any more than Lebanon has. And there are a lot of ideas as to how to sort of shore up those civil society organizations and institutions that are still semi-functioning, while also not empowering the political class that is responsible for this horrible situation the country is in. So I'll stop there and kick it back off to you, Chris, and just happy to continue to talk more about some of these other ideas.
Amazing. Thanks, Philippe. And Renda, Philippe, let me bring you into the conversation here. Philippe raised a few points, partially about the socioeconomic collapse, for sure, but also some more security concerns, right? So first of all, when it comes to the armed forces or, the security apparatus in Lebanon, but also to the Hezbollah bit. And, no easy questions here, really, but how do you deal with that effectively as, part of the civil society who are protesting on the streets, who have suffered really through all that? I can think of phases, right? So you had the phase right after the October Revolution, the the weeks after it, then a severe crackdown early January 2020, and then the biggest one, I think, in my mind, was the one in the days after the Beirut port explosion. And you had obviously the security forces, whatever that means, right? You have the armed forces, you have intelligence, you have the internal security forces, so a plethora in a way of security forces, and you have Hezbollah that played a very big role, especially early on, with intimidation tactics and all internal pressures on partners, political partners. And all of these types of pressures and efforts really on the ground to kind of thwart all of these efforts. So how do you approach that? How do you think about that component, the security apparatus and forces, but also the Hezbollah piece when it comes to oppression in a way of human and civil rights in Lebanon? Oops, you're muted, Linda. Sorry, go ahead.
First, let me thank you, Chris, for inviting me to join my good friends, Aya and Philippe, on this panel. It is really an honor and pleasure to be with them. I mean, they are the experts on human rights, in my opinion, on this panel, so I'm going to add some political contextualization. Let me just, before answering directly your question, just take a step back, build on something Aya and Philippe have said, and in terms of how we got here and the drivers of the different actors that are involved in this tragedy, really, that Lebanon is going through and suffering, what have been their drivers. And let me quote here something from a study done by Robert Rothberg, who studied states, weak states, and then he has the study on strong states, weak states, failed states, collapsed states. And I'm not going to go into the different criterias, but by the way, the main criterion he used in distinguishing strong from weak from failed is their ability to provide human security, the ability of the states, because human security is the primary political good that underpins the social contracts between citizens and government. And the less a state provides and able to guarantee human security, the weaker it is, eventually reaching the point of collapse. So if you look at that continuum that Rothberg put out, Lebanon is right now is a failed state by all the criteria he measures, not only human security, but also, the ability to provide other goods, knowledge goods, health goods, communication goods, banking goods, all of this, and guarantee mediation through nonviolence of disputes, guarantee civil peace. These are some other criteria in defining weak, strong, failed. So Lebanon today is a failed state. And then what we need to do is think of intervention to prevent it into becoming a total collapse state. And so this is where we are. And we are really into a very small window of opportunity, where international intervention, regional intervention, people in Lebanon can work together in order to prevent that fall into collapse. I'm more on the pessimistic side, and I don't think that collapse is going to be preventable. But it doesn't mean that I cannot argue for measures, but the question is the will. So let me quote something from Rothberg's essay. And here, quote, he says, "For a state to fail is not that easy. Crossing from weakness into failure takes will as well as neglect." End of quote. And I think what we have here, building on what Aya said, quoting the World Bank, we have a political class that has willingly brought Lebanon to where it is and has willingly rejected from engage in the kind of reforms that can bring in the international economic assistance that is needed to bring back Lebanon away from to bring it out of the hole it has dug itself into, or they have dug the country into. So they have willfully, refused to form a government. They have willfully refused to engage in the structural economic reforms. They have willfully engaged in corruption at all levels, of the society. They have willfully brought the country into the poverty. That's the will part. And so for us to be able to change that situation, we need to think about how can we change that will? How can we change that cost-benefit calculus, that underpins that makes them eventually willing to engage in these reforms. And we know that there have been positive incentives put on the table for a long time, right, by the international community in terms of economic assistance, in terms of, in return for this class engaging in reform. So the positive incentives have not worked. We know that. So now we have seen the United States engage in the negative incentives, basically sanctions on some of the leaders that are engaged in. But again, that kind of action is not going to make much of a difference unless it's a concerted action by all countries that have influence over Lebanese politics, including Europeans, including Gulf countries, and the Americans, and by a sustained effort in pursuing this policy. So more sanction rather than less sanction, but more targeted sanctions on the political actors that have proven to be obstacles to reforms, and across the political spectrum. So it's not only pro-US versus anti-US or anti-US versus, and not only using the anti-terrorism laws, using the Magnitsky Act, using, human rights violation as a criterion in punishing these perpetrators of. So that's on the will side. On the neglect side, I think the international community has for a long time enabled this political class to basically engage in this kind of games, whether it's through assistance. For a long time, it has lent assistance to Lebanon while saying we need reforms, but not conditioning assistance or reforms. Okay, now we are at the stage of conditioning assistance, and finally we got here. But somehow, I don't know if it's too late, but that's also something that the international community need to stick to, and no assistance until reforms are enacted. But then in the interim, how can you promote the resilience of people? How can you enable people to stay in their country? How can you prevent people from going hungry? And that's where Philip's, intervention mentioned, which is the kind of humanitarian assistance that need to be given to the Lebanese. There was a report issued by MEI, ATFL, and LIFE, in which they talk of a direct humanitarian emergency fund to the Lebanese that bypasses the Lebanese government. This is something that Dan Serwer and I talked about earlier in August 2014 in terms of establishing an authority that is consisting of the donor funds manned by an international authority, by an international international figure respected to managing crisis, and with the help of Lebanese experts to disperse aid, to design reconstruction of the port, to disperse contract, all of the decision-making, bypassing the government. However, which bring back to the human rights issue. We have had a port blast that killed more than 200 people, correct? 300,000 have lost their homes. Half of the city destroyed, We know now this is due to negligence of keeping ammonium nitrate, thousands of kilograms in the port, unguarded space for more than 6 years. And yet we have an investigation that was promised to be concluded 5 days after the blast on August 4. Today is April 21. We have yet to see that report. And that's where, again, the international community neglect. So when there was an international conference convened by France right after the blast, instead of what they did is they called for this impartial, transparent investigation, but to be done at the request, not at request, but under the word that they have used, I think, is under the authority, under contingent upon the support of the Lebanese government. So again, instead of calling for this independent international investigation, some kind of a fact-finding community, not a repeat of the Hariri investigation, which took years and years and years, but some kind of a fact-finding commission that is to be established independent of the Lebanese government, we left the investigation to the government. The international community, and especially France, US, and all this, left it to the Lebanese government, and here we are. No report after month of the supposedly investigation be launched. So being where we are, question of security forces. I think definitely there is a problem with the security forces. I mean, Aya cited the number of human rights violations by security forces, and there are different security forces. There is the Lebanese army, there is the ISF, the internal security forces, there is the police that is, affiliated with the parliament, there is the police that is, there are allegation of torture by the military intelligence unit of the Lebanese army, of Syrian refugees allegedly accused of terrorism. So you have different actors, different security actors, and you have also the killings by non-state actors. The last being is Luqman Slim, who was killed in the south in an area that is controlled by Hezbollah. And he has been a long-term opponent of Hezbollah. He has been threatened by Hezbollah. And yet that investigation, which supposedly is being carried by the police, has not gone anywhere. We haven't heard anything about the investigation and its whereabouts. And so you have all these security actors, some of them are state, some of them are non-state, that are engaged in this human rights violation. And you add on that a judiciary that is definitely not independent and definitely does not engage in transparency. And so putting this together makes it a lethal combination of a place where, reforms are of course needed, but they're going to be very hard to be implemented without a very, very strong hand by the international community. I went too long, I think. I'm going to stop here.
No, that's very valuable. Thanks, Renda. And I want to particularly zone in on two things, I think, by reflecting that conversation to you, Aya. So Renda talked about two things that I want to focus on. One is this notion of carrots are not working. Let's try some sticks. Let's try some potentially sanctions and look at this political class and establishment as an entity or people, a bunch of people, really, 6 or 7 leaders that have no incentive whatsoever to potentially make any changes along the lines of reform. So that's one. The second one is this notion of impunity, right? So you have half of a capital explode, impunity. You have political killings, impunity. So what do you do with this effectively? What is the strategy at HRW? But I also want to turn that to you in a second, Philippe, at Amnesty. How do we see the way forward when it comes to this climate of impunity? And what are ways, since a lot of the hope seems to have been lost domestically to achieve anything, and the fiasco of the past week in the judiciary system is, if anything, a case in point about the capabilities and the political interferences, really, that have crippled that system for far too long at this stage. So when you're looking at that, Aya, at this climate of impunity and at this lack of incentives that Renda has touched upon, how do you think about the way forward? How do you think about the international community's involvement to push towards more, justice to begin with, but also to unlock this path of reform, not only economically, which is a discussion to have to be had separately, but at the human rights front, right? When people are going to the streets to voice over their grievances, when people are, protesting or being arrested or being locked up or shot at on the, people are getting shot in the eyes and the chest, etc. So how do you think about that going forward? And what can the international partners, the international community, but also potentially international NGOs do to shed light and also try to push and stop this slide into chaos and human rights violations? Sorry, long question, but I think this is what we'll spend our time discussing for the rest half hour of this conversation.
Thanks, Christophe. I mean, what Renda said, I think, is really key, that despite the scale of the economic crisis in Lebanon, despite the scale of suffering, and despite the international community telling Lebanon, we are willing to give you money, help us, help you, the leaders have been completely just have their head buried in the sand. I don't know what they're doing, but they literally have not taken a single policy on the path to reform, and a single policy that they have known that they have to take since the 2018 SADC conference to unlock billions of dollars in aid. So initially, after the blast, I think there was, it was a very obvious example of just how much the Lebanese government had failed its people. We knew that from the economic crisis, but the economic crisis was gradual and things happen every day, and it's hard to pinpoint blame on a few individuals. But the Beirut blast was a very obvious example of the scale of corruption and incompetence of the Lebanese government. So right after the blast, I think there was some momentum in Lebanon first, people saying this government doesn't represent me. I mean, during the protests that happened 4 days after the blast, there were people carrying pictures of various politicians with nooses. I mean, and including politicians, like Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, who people would not have dared do that in the past. But people were so fed up that you saw, in a public space, pictures of all of these politicians with nooses around their head. People were done with this regime. And then on the international side as well, you had, initially Macron's first visit, he came, he went to the streets, he told, he said all the right things. He said sanctions, international investigation. So his first visit was very hopeful for many people here who thought that the international community is finally realizing what we have known for a very long time, that this Lebanese regime is not a partner. But unfortunately, that was quickly tempered down, I think in large part due to the French initiative, when Macron decided to give these politicians a chance. He gave them this paper. He said, you have this time frame to do these reforms. And so that really dampened both the mood in the country. It showed that the international community was willing once again to extend a hand to this awful, awful regime. And also within the international community, everybody seemed to take their lead from France. And so France, gave the Lebanese government and the Lebanese authorities some time to work out their stuff. And the international community stepped back and said, Lebanon is traditionally France's issue. And so they let France take the lead. Obviously, this French initiative failed. I mean, there's absolutely nothing to show for it. That they missed the first deadline, which was forming a government. And despite constant, there are companies who want to rebuild the port. There are, the IMF is literally begging, the IMF here is the good actor. They're literally begging the government to implement reforms so they can unlock billions of dollars in aid. You have all the Sadr donors saying, we want to give you money, but you need to do these reforms, and nothing. So really, the only solution, I think, is personal sanctions on these individuals, because as long as, they were able to get their money out of the country, they're living, their lives are relatively unharmed. Their kids are abroad studying at the best schools and universities. So the economic crisis hasn't touched them personally. So sanctions, personal GLOMAG sanctions against individuals responsible for human rights abuses and corruption is really key to change their calculus. It'll change the calculus of the entire political class, because it'll show that there are costs to being engaged in this kind of corruption and human rights abuse. It will show others entering the political system that there are costs to this kind of behavior, and it will gradually sideline these individuals when they're not able to access their assets or their money in the international financial system. They won't be able to give handouts to people. They won't be able to build the same sort of clientelistic networks. And so gradually they'll be sidelined, giving more room for truly independent voices to emerge. So I think on the sticks side, the carrots aren't working. The sticks, I think one of the best tools the international community has is the GLOMAG type sanctions. And then on your second question of impunity, this is something that we've been thinking about for a while. It's the $1 million question. How do you address this culture of impunity in the country? And there really are no easy answers, but some of our thoughts are one on the security forces. So you have, Lebanon is quite a non-traditional country in a sense that, well, maybe not too non-traditional for MENA, but most of the security agencies' funding comes from international donors. So international donors have a lot of leverage over security agencies, and they can use this leverage to force them to be more accountable and to force them to be more human rights compliant when carrying out their operations. And we have seen this work in the past. There was one example in 2017, I believe, when the ISF stopped funding a part of the when the UK stopped funding a part of the ISF until they improved their human rights policy and human rights practices. So this does work, and we have seen some security agencies are more accountable than others because of some security agencies receive external funding, some security agencies don't. But here I think there is a big responsibility on the international community, and particularly donors to Lebanon's security forces, to ensure that their money is not going to fund abusive units who are engaged in human rights abuses. That's one. And then two, on the judiciary, I mean, the judiciary is incredibly politicized, and it has, the incident that you were referring to where there was a dispute between two judges who belonged to two different political parties, and their supporters went out onto the street in support of these judges. It's bizarre. This is the clearest example of just how politicized our judiciary is. So one strand that we're working on is the supporting a law put forward by civil society on the independence of the judiciary that would change the entire appointment system for judges and make them less susceptible to political pressure and sectarian quotas. But we are thinking more broadly about impunity in Lebanon, because just passing a law, isn't necessarily going to change the culture of impunity in the country, though it will go a long way to improving it. So one of the things that we've been, trying to research and explore is this idea of a hybrid justice system. So there are examples from countries like Guatemala and the Central African Republic, where the international community, with support from local actors, established it's a domestic, well, there are different models, but so for example, Guatemala, there was an international commission against impunity, where there was sort of this UN commission was attached to the public prosecutor's office there. So they acted as assistant prosecutors to the Guatemalan prosecutor's office. They did capacity building, but they also gave judges political cover to go after some very high level people. So while working with this commission against impunity, the Guatemalan judiciary was able to go after people as high up as the president for corruption. So, perhaps something, we're thinking of what are some innovative ideas that we can look to in Lebanon's case that would really help solve this impunity issue. So the hybrid model is one that we're really thinking about, because it's not a stopgap solution. It's one intended to really be sustainable. It's really intended to build the capacity of the local judiciary and start changing the culture of impunity and start allowing the very good judges that do exist in Lebanon to do really hard-hitting work and really tackle the corruption in the country.
Thanks, incredibly valuable insights and proposals. So let me turn to you, Philippe, as well. So you sit in DC, right, obviously, but I can imagine, and that's along the lines of what Randa said about this need for concerted effort. So you're sitting in DC or in Brussels, in the Gulf, et cetera, and you really want to be part of this drive towards stopping the slide into abuses. Where do you start? What do you think about? Well, what are your comments, first of all, on what Aya said, and how would you complement these with further measures that can be put on the table and brought forth when thinking about conditionality of support, but also beyond that? So how do you address that, and how are you thinking about it?
Yeah, Aya's recommendations were spot on. All of them are political and structurally focused, and I think they absolutely need to happen. I think Randa's commentary specifically on accountability and how we got to where we are right now in Lebanon, which has been a lack of accountability on every crime that's been committed in the country for a very long time, which is how you have so many of these people who are responsible for egregious human rights abuses during the Lebanese civil war in power now. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But to your question, Chris, about what we need to do right now, right this second, I think there's two things. I think that these structural reforms, these political reforms are absolutely necessary and need to happen. However, we're at the point now where we need to treat Lebanon like you treat a nation that has been struck by a massive earthquake or multiple hurricanes, and there needs to be a humanitarian emergency response led by the United States and European countries, UN-led effort, whomever, but it needs to be led and driven immediately to provide humanitarian assistance to the country. Because what you have to do right now at this point, since things have gotten so bad, and since these structural reforms take time to see the benefits of them, and they absolutely need to happen, you have to immediately deliver food aid to the country. You have to immediately assist in waste processing, in some vital infrastructure problems like a lack of electricity. These are things that can actually be done without giving money and writing checks to the Lebanese government. You don't have to also unlock all of the billions of dollars that the IMF and other institutions have waiting for Lebanon to implement reforms. Those need to be unlocked, they need to be delivered. But right now, we need to have ships arriving with food aid, water, medicine for Lebanon, vaccines for Lebanon. We need people helping to distribute all of this aid. We don't just want to leave it for the government to distribute, or for civil society groups, because they'll be overwhelmed at the volume of the aid. They need people assisting in the distribution of these goods and materials. They need to be paid for by donor countries. There needs to be an immediate response to prevent Lebanon from turning violent, from people who are so desperate, so hungry, so scared for the future, for them to continue to take to the streets, be met with excessive use of force, and then respond with force back. And this is what happens in countries that become so collapsed, and hope is so lost by the people that live there. So I think first, the United States needs to be talking. We need President Biden talking to the European heads of state, the EU, NATO, the United Nations, as to how to go about delivering this humanitarian rescue plan that can be implemented as soon as possible for Lebanon. The second is this accountability mechanism. People in Lebanon are angry because disasters happen cyclically in the country. The Beirut port blast was obviously extremely unique in the sense that this was the worst non-nuclear explosion in human history, and was the result of extreme negligence and corruption. And we still have a lot of questions that have been unanswered, but it's a part of a pattern of a lack of accountability, of bad things happening in Lebanon and to the Lebanese people. So there needs to be a longer term process set up, led by a neutral body, so the United Nations, one that won't take as long as the special tribunal, as Randa mentioned, that can start to figure out who is responsible for these specific horrible situations, such as the Beirut port blast, or some of the assassinations that have riddled the country over the past decade, that have all remained largely unsolved, and targeted some of the brightest and best minds in the country who would have contributed to a better system of governance that would have prevented this economic situation that Lebanon is in now. So there's a lot of things that have been happening, and no accountability whatsoever has been found, and no answers have been given to people as to how all of these assassinations have gone uninvestigated and unreported, essentially, how the Beirut port blast could have happened without the authorities really knowing about how dangerous these materials were stored and why were they stored there for so long. Why is the country experienced such a currency crisis and an economic crisis that it's in right now? All of these questions need investigations, and there needs to be a process that is done independently, that's impartial, that can provide these answers to Lebanon and to the international community. I think that is a confidence instilling measure that will set Lebanon up for success in the long term. So I think that needs to happen. I think the third point is a lot of what Aya has been talking about, and to the extent that Randa has as well, which is some of these immediate reforms that need to be implemented. And how do you do that when you have a political class that is refusing to either step aside and allow these reforms to be implemented, because it is at the expense, in some case, of their ability to retain power eventually, which is really the intractable problem we have here. But you counter those positions, at least their positions, by saying that you will have nothing left to rule over if you continue down this path, essentially. And you're not going to be getting all of this assistance that needs to come into the country. And the country will continue to, as we say, slide into the abyss. And so I think what needs to happen in terms of these reforms is you have to have a way for the government itself to be able to allow this sort of like technocratic group of people to run things over the next several years, so things are more stabilized while these reforms are discussed and negotiated, while accountability mechanisms are set up and put in place to find people responsible for all of these ills that Lebanon finds itself in. And during the meantime, people are now being fed and getting the medicine and the food and the electricity they need to at least survive. I think, you have to, at this point, since you have so many compounding crises, really put first sort of a humanitarian response, because, the ultimate, I don't think there are many people that fall into the school of thought, but there are people that believe, policymakers, that if you just continue to heap enough pressure on Lebanon and the Lebanese people, they will explode and rise up against Hezbollah, and you'll have, this dream state that will evolve in the future. One that can get all the money that it needs to sort of stabilize itself. That's not how it works. I think that when people are hungry and there's no medicine, there's no food, there's no economy left, they can turn on each other. They can turn on neighboring states. You have a situation that spirals out of control. So you have to sort of prioritize that humanitarian response first, because ultimately it's a human rights focused response that needs to be implemented immediately. I'm happy to talk more about that, but I'll stop.
Thanks, Philippe. So I want to move to some Q&A questions in 5 minutes potentially, but I just wanted to come back to this point of Hezbollah, right, which is obviously critical, which is very often an impediment, right, in the way of potential engagement with, forget about the Lebanese government, but the Lebanese people in general. So what are some of the views, and this is kind of a free-for-all, whoever wants to chime in, please feel free. So one, how do you think about Hezbollah, and how do you deal with it? Sure, this is a longer term that is probably a regional issue to be solved, and at this stage, well, many years ago, beyond the scope of Lebanese politics, really. But how do you deal with that part within this humanitarian response and these pressures and sanctions that we're proposing on individual politicians? And my hypothesis is that there are way less effective vis-a-vis Hezbollah than vis-a-vis the select politicians that are in charge. So that's one, if one of you would like to comment on Hezbollah's part. And let me just bundle this and kind of keep it free for all for the next 5 or 6, 7 minutes, is that, in a lot of conversations we have, very often some of the criticism or some of the kind of devil's advocate role that is being played is along two lines. First is, so Hezbollah, obviously. Second of all is that there's always advocacy on behalf of supporting the Lebanese armed forces, so the army mainly, as the backbone of, the remaining backbone of Lebanese institutions. So how do you reconcile this with the potential human rights violations that we've discussed throughout this panel? So how do you reconcile the need for support versus, on the other hand, potential human rights violations? And then third, if you'd like to comment on that, is this notion of, well, they've brought it upon themselves. And this is something you very often hear in some of the circles in DC, but also in Europe about, these guys have brought it upon themselves as a people. So how do you address and how do you think about these things? So Hezbollah, 1, the Lebanese armed forces, 2, and then 3, it's kind of their own making. So totally up to you. I don't know, Randa, if you want to kick us off for the next couple of minutes, and then we give it to Aya before moving to Q&A.
I'll be quick because these are tough questions and I've been thinking about them, and I don't think I have ready-made solutions or answers to your question, because I'm still struggling, especially the issue of Hezbollah. What do you do about it? What do you do about it? Okay, we have heaped sanction after sanction after sanction on it, and then at some point the anti-Hezbollah sanctions are going to start to have diminishing returns, and I think we are already there. I mean, they are not inside the financial system. Their cash is still being brought, on planes from Iran. Recently, they have established all these supermarkets, at subsidized prices for their communities. They have now are issuing ration cards, creating this parallel system of security assistance at the time when the Lebanese government is still bickering with the World Bank about their social safety net program. So, and people, so whatever there was discontent inside the Shia community, which in my opinion, look, what you have to do about Hezbollah, the Shia have to do it. I'm sorry. It's just until that support for Hezbollah, the way it is, with all the roles it plays, is eroded inside the Shia community, it's not going to be easy to do much about Hezbollah, besides what we have been doing and has been working, not working in my opinion. I mean, today Hezbollah is stronger than it used to be 5 years in terms of the weapons it has. It had protests inside the Shia community a year and a half ago, which really were starting to gather momentum. Today, they went away, discontent still exists, but they're trying to make up with this regaining, or how to say, doing what they started doing in 1980 and 1982, 1983, which is reclaiming their social security kind of support system that for a while they left it to the states, because since 2005, that's where, a lot of that social security support net was hopefully being taken up by the state to the Shia, and Hezbollah could pivot more to a regional role, to the war in Syria and all of this. Now, with the collapse or with the failure of the state in providing that kind of social services, now Hezbollah is forced to take them up again, which I think have in the past 4 or 5 years letting go of them. Anyway, so what do you do then? If you are an international player, okay, you impose sanctions. I mean, what can you do? I mean, there is already deterrence mutual rules of deterrence between them and Israel on the border, and both parties, including Israel, seems to be okay with it and not willing to upend that. So unless you have a strong state that is, and a Shia community that is basically saying to Hezbollah, this status quo is no longer acceptable to us, I think it's going to be extremely hard to change this, really extremely hard, because there's no other party that can, inside the Lebanese political spectrum, that has all these bases, all these, how to say, bases of power that they have accumulated over the years due to the negligence of their partners in the political system and their opponents in the Lebanese political system. So absent a total overhaul of the political system, I don't have a ready-made answer, except that you have to play a long-term game. And part of that long-term game is a support to the Lebanese army. Granted, there have been violations by certain units. Granted, I don't think there are, there's enough attention paid to protecting protesters, in my opinion, by some units of the army. The United States has given more than $2 billion to the army since 2007. And I think because of that, we have the right to insist on zero tolerance for violence against protesters and civil society activists. I think that should be communicated to the head of the army. The head of the army has to invest in training, has to exact, punishments against units and members of the armed forces that engage in this kind of behavior. And there are units that are well known to have engaged in this kind of behavior. There are leaders within the army, that are well known to have, turned a blind eye to this behavior. And so I think they can work, the leadership, which I think is working, which is, in my opinion, well-intentioned, especially the head of the army, the commander, I think can introduce the kind of reforms with the appropriate pressure from the United States of basically introducing better military doctrine, I think, that is more cognizant of human protection, civilian protection, and follows on that. So I'll stop here.
Thanks, Renda. Aya, any thoughts on that as well?
I don't have the solution to the Hezbollah problem either. But I will say that as Renda mentioned, they are benefiting off of the weakness of the Lebanese state, because they are able to run their business the way they see fit without any state to impose any kind of, surveillance or control or any limits on the kinds of things that they're engaged in. And so they have really, since the October 2019 protests, emerged as protectors of the system. And I think this is very dangerous for them, because before then, people could, Hezbollah wasn't seen, they were in government, but they were sort of, not responsible for the corruption. They were, calling out, never by name, but they would say, oh, the Lebanese government is corrupt, we're different, and we have discipline. And, they were always careful to distance themselves from the Lebanese political establishment. But after the October 17 protests, they really very quickly emerged as protectors of the government. They called, people who are protesting against the government, they said that they were being paid by foreign agents, and so they quickly dismissed the protest movement. And I think, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out in the future. But I think this has raised a lot of questions about the role that they're playing in Lebanon, and and this is evident in the Shia protests that we saw at the beginning of the movement. And I interviewed people from Bint Jbeil, from Nabatie, from Sur, really Hezbollah strongholds, who were, in the hundreds, demanding change, demanding that Hezbollah and Nabi Berri step down. I mean, this is language that we never used to hear before. Yes, they were beaten and they were arrested and they were threatened and they were driven out of these areas. But it means that this discontent is brewing within the Shia community. And they are feeling the economic crisis. They are, it hasn't yet changed the way that they're operating, but they are feeling the sanctions and the dollar crunch. And Hezbollah, Nasrallah, a couple of weeks ago gave a speech saying, we can't afford to pay everybody in dollars. So if you're getting paid in dollars, please help your neighbor who's not being paid in dollars. I mean, so there are, I think the economic crisis will have an impact on them. But as Renda said, also, it's a long game. It's not like, tomorrow there's going to be an uprising against Hezbollah and that will be that. And much of it, I think, will be outside of Lebanon's hands. It'll be a regional issue, not something that protesters in Lebanon are going to change.
Please, Renda, go ahead.
Yeah. Quickly, because I want Philippe to comment on this. Listen, in Hezbollah talks the talk about corruption, but really internally, in terms of modus operandi, they haven't translated this talk into any kind of political program or instrumentalities to fight corruption. Basically, they are happy, as Aya says, to keep the system as is and the status quo as is, because the status quo has been beneficial to them. Now, when the status quo becomes too unbearable for their constituents, meaning economically, as is happening now for the Shia constituency, they are coming up with these alternative plans to amend that. But they are really not doing anything to change the system, because the system and the status quo is in their favor. So they will be the last one to embark on any attempt to change the system or to introduce reforms. Well, as I said, I mean, they can take care of their own through alternative plans, through parallel intervention, and keep the system as is, because for this whole, role that, because as I said, they need that system to be as corrupt. They need that system to be as malfunctioning. They need that system to be, as weak as it has proven to be over the years.
And if anything, when all's done and dusted, in a way, they will likely be the last person standing, in a way, in the room, right? Because of subsistence mechanism. Yeah. Philippe, let me turn to you as well for like your last thoughts on be it Hezbollah or the LAF, or, some of the talks in DC as well on, help us help you type of thing. So totally up to you.
Yeah. A couple things. I'd say quickly that I think Granda's comments on the LAF were spot on. I think there have obviously been some really unfortunate violations that have been committed by the LAF, but the LAF has been receiving funding, and that funding is in the form of training, not just weaponry from the United States. And that training, I think, has actually paid off. It's a very low bar to clear in the Middle East and North Africa if the United States gives you money for your military and they don't start killing people. But that bar was largely cleared by the LAF, unlike a slew of other countries in the region, where you've seen protesters killed by military or paramilitary forces. Iraq is one. Hundreds and hundreds of protesters have been killed in the protests there, for example. So I do think that is a sort of a small bright spot in terms of the assistance having a positive impact. And I think that when we talk about things more medium to long term, the Biden administration can do, it's looking at that funding for the LAF and making sure that there's appropriate human rights training that goes into those forces as well, and rooting out the ones that have committed violations, as Aya was talking about. And I think that assistance should extend to the police, because they were the ones that obviously are doing plenty of violations as well that weren't necessarily under the command and control of the LAF. So I think we have to look at the security system as a whole in Lebanon and adjust accordingly. I also think that we have to double down on the needs for accountability. And I think that we can't forget that because I think that will allow Lebanon to heal. And it needs some healing and it needs some trust in its institutions again once they are rebuilt. So I think we have to make sure that in all of our conversation on Lebanon, that is sort of front and center, in addition to this immediate humanitarian response that needs to take place. And a final thought, I mean, I think on Hezbollah, I'll say that, I don't think that group can really shield its community or its supporters from this titanic collapse in the country. I think that, ultimately that's a huge burden for it to really hold. I think it knows that. I think that the US, in talking with Iran, as negotiations slowly start to ramp up between the US and Iran, if they ever do fully, there needs to be the issue of Hezbollah needs to be addressed. I don't think it was appropriately addressed enough years ago. I think it needs to be addressed now. That seems like a titanic effort. But frankly, everything we've talked about today has been a titanic effort. So, I'll add one more to the list of things that I think the US government will have to do in engaging some of these other regional power players as well, who are responsible for a lot of what Lebanon has gone through, without also letting the Lebanese government off the hook. Because in the end of the day, everybody in Lebanon knows that these failures are at the feet of the Lebanese government over decades of mismanagement. And that is the ultimate issue that all of us have been discussing today.
That's incredibly helpful and clear. Well, our time's unfortunately up. I think we've covered a lot of grounds. Sorry if we didn't get to all the Q&A parts, but hopefully we addressed some of the questions you've raised. So thank you, Randa, Aya, and Philippe, for taking the time for this conversation. Thank you for joining us on today's panel as well. I'll see some of you tomorrow on our Climate Week panel dedicated to Lebanon. And with that, have a great rest of your day.